we're going to pick up right where we left off last week, getting into section 6 of On the Prejudices of Philosophers from Beyond Good and Evil. And I was going to do a brief recap of some of the things that we covered last week, but I think that actually this aphorism will do a great job, in a sense, of summarizing many of the considerations of the previous week. And so let's just get right into the passage, where Nietzsche says, quote, "Gradually, it has become clear to me what every great philosophy so far has been, namely, the personal confession of its author and a kind of involuntary and unconscious memoir. Also, that the moral or immoral intentions in every philosophy constituted the real germ of life, from which the whole plant had grown. Indeed, if one would explain how the abstrusest metaphysical claims of a philosopher really came about, it is always well and wise to ask first, at what morality does all this, does he aim? Accordingly, I do not believe that a drive to knowledge is the father of philosophy, but rather that another drive has, here as elsewhere, employed understanding and misunderstanding as a mere instrument. But anyone who considers the basic drives of man to see to what extent they may have been at play just here as inspiring spirits, or demons and kobolds, will find that all of them have done philosophy at some time, and that every single one of them would like only too well to represent just itself as the ultimate purpose of existence and the legitimate master of all the other drives, for every drive wants to be master, and it attempts to philosophize in that spirit." End quote. So the criticism that Nietzsche makes of philosophers, that in some sense he brings to the forefront from the very beginning of the preface, supposing truth is a woman, what then? So supposing that the pursuit of truth was something passionate, a drive that is not this dispassionate, detached will to truth, or as he puts it here, a drive to knowledge, that in fact the drive to knowledge is itself an instrument. It's being employed by some other drive. And so this ties in with what he said, that behind logic and its seeming sovereignty of movement there stand valuations, physiological demands for the preservation of a certain way of life. So something which is instinctual, impulsive, passionate, one or another of our drives, all of them like to do philosophy. He says all of them have done philosophy at one point or another. And so a philosopher's perspective is not just his time and place. It's not just the accidents of his birth and the circumstances around him that will shape the nature of his philosophy, right? That's often how I've described the congenital defect of philosophers, as Nietzsche called it in Human All Too Human, that the philosopher takes what's near and dear to him and represents it as the whole world. What we mean by saying what's near and dear to the philosopher doesn't just mean the sort of what's near to him in the physical sense or in a temporal sense, but what's in his heart. The drives, the impulses, the things that are his actual true goals. He says the moral or immoral intentions in every philosophy constituted the real germ from which the entire plant had grown. So the entire plant, that the philosophy starts with a seed, which is some drive or another within the philosopher that then wants to interpret the world entirely in its own spirit. So in the case of Schopenhauer, to use that example again, Nietzsche's psychologizing of Schopenhauer is that he has this very strong sexual impulse that he feels at war with, and thus he embraces the philosophy of the ascetic, of conquering and tyrannizing over one's own impulses as the moral end towards which all existence ought to aim in Schopenhauer's view. I've also looked at how, I think I've brought this up in another episode, about how, Immanuel Kant was very much a hypochondriac and prone to what he called melancholic feelings, and very much obsessed with this idea of the will's ability to master one's feelings, which he used as a means, this intense focus and concentration of willing away one's anxious or depressive thoughts, right? That Kant is the kind of person who believes in the ability of reason to master the passions, because that's what he sort of self-identifies with as this lifelong academic and intellectuals, the ability of the intellect to, dominate and ultimately do away with one's anxious, or as he says, melancholic thoughts. And so one could then reinterpret all of Kant's philosophy in light of that, and the fact that he arrives at this categorical imperative of this sovereign use of our reason in order to overcome wayward impulses or something of that nature. I guess Kant and Schopenhauer end up being rather similar in that regard. But I mean, most philosophers end up coming to some sort of understanding of morality that's not too dissimilar to that, going all the way back to Plato. The point being, the model that Nietzsche is giving us of the self, and more importantly, of thinking, of mentation in this passage, just something that he's been building on up to this point, that what your thinking is not like that this drive to knowledge is something indirect, it's something instrumental. The will to truth, then, is something instrumental. It's something that's being used by a more fundamental drive. And this would be, the logic behind this would be in the same way that you could say that consciousness itself, or rational cognitive functioning, is something built on top of the physiological embodied existence of organisms. That life arose without knowledge, and knowledge was created in order to serve life, right? And so the great hubris and the mistake of the philosopher has been in imagining that they have somehow broken out of this just by, as Kant would have it, like being able to will away these physiology or impulses, that they could have a drive to knowledge which is sovereign and separate, that doesn't spring from the germ, the seed, the starting place of some drive or instinct. That philosophy itself is the tool of a desire. It's the tool of an instinct trying to get what it wants. And that philosophy is the expression of that drive in the realm of the intellect, which therefore, in the hands of various different people, depending on what their goals might be, their moral or immoral ends, we get all these different philosophical constructions of the world. They completely reinterpret and reconstruct the world in the cognitive realm in order to mirror what is inside of them. And indeed, this is sort of the continental tradition, as I've pointed out with Schopenhauer, that he was going back to the pure rational ego cogito of Descartes, that you start the philosophical journey by looking within and looking for what immediate certainties are within you, and then using that in order to come to some certainties about the world at large. And so at this point in the argument that Nietzsche has presented, we should completely reevaluate what was happening there, right? That it wasn't actually Schopenhauer, when he's looking deep within him, trying to penetrate deep within his own consciousness to know what it is that is most fundamental within him. Nietzsche looks at that and says, no, you're revealing the world according to Schopenhauer. You're not revealing anything of the world itself. And that's what we're all doing. And so we'll finish out the passage where Nietzsche says, quote, "To be sure, among scholars who are really scientific men, things may be different. Better, if you like. There you may really find something like a drive for knowledge, some small independent clockwork that, once well wound, works on vigorously without any essential participation from all the other drives of the scholar. The real interests of the scholar, therefore, lie usually somewhere else, say in his family, or in making money, or in politics. Indeed, it is almost a matter of total indifference whether his little machine is placed at this or that spot in science, and whether the promising young worker turns himself into a good philologist, or an expert on fungi, or a chemist. It does not characterize him that he becomes this or that. In the philosopher, conversely, there is nothing whatever that is impersonal. And above all, his morality bears decided and decisive witness to who he is. That is, in what order of rank the innermost drives of his nature stand in relation to each other." End quote. So there's that term, order of rank, again. And it's really the last I guess, couple phrases where Nietzsche provides us with something that is really core to his argument at large as we've been following it, that, the philosopher, there's nothing whatever that is impersonal, and his morality bears decided and decisive witness to who he is. So that's that rejection of the separation between what we are and what we do, seeing beings as processes instead of something static and essentialized, and looking at in the term order of rank again, that Nietzsche thinks this rank ordering of things is something inescapable in life, that there is always, what would you say, in the conflict and clashing between the drives, right? The competition will necessarily set one above the other. So the Heraclitean notion that war is the father of all and strife is justice. That strife, this principle, necessarily creates this inequality, this rank ordering of things, and that every person is this bundle of drives, but it's not total anarchy in the same sense that nature, I guess it is anarchy, and that there's no law in the sense of an actual law governing what's happening, but insofar as, like, we might say in the sense of Heraclitus's logos, there is a law, right? The laws of natural selection and survival of the fittest. So in the same way, and that's how you create, over time in ecosystems, a sort of equilibrium. It's not like harmony, right? Because everything's eating each other to survive. But organisms fill their niche, and an apex predator comes to the top of the food chain, so on and so forth. And so too with all of us, all of our drives end up ordering themselves into this hierarchy. And Nietzsche is saying this is what bears witness to who and what we are, is the drives, the hierarchy of drives insofar as what we actually follow and what manifests in our actions. And in the domain of philosophy, it's that fundamental drive to that philosopher, whatever the top drive is, that is going to, that's at the top of the order of rank of his innermost nature, that's what's really producing his philosophy. And these comments about scholars, I think, are fairly interesting, because Nietzsche is he's heading off at the pass, the charge, like, well, there are career scholars or scientists who really, all they care about is getting to the truth, right? And what he's saying is, if they're doing this sort of disinterested knowledge seeking, that means their interests lie elsewhere, because we're not disinterested creatures. So, we could imagine somebody who's a tenured professor teaching biology at Oxford, right? But that the average type of person like this is not, terribly consumed with angst and anticipation over the next, cutting edge discoveries in, sequencing the genome of the earthworm or whatever, that a lot of the work they do is actually rather tedious, that these people who don't have like this deep emotional investment in what they're doing, usually it's because they're just a career biologist, right? That's what their career is. That's how they make money. And it might just be that that's what they're there for, or it might be, we can be more charitable by that with our assessment. Like maybe their real interests lie in their family, right? So they're not just that they're greedy, but they want to have a good, stable career that's respectable, and that's their way of taking care of their family. Or Freud might come along and say, and that's their way of attaining status and attracting a mate, right? Or he says it might be in politics. Like maybe they have their career and then they have other interests elsewhere that get them really excited. They have their hobbies, or they have their political interests, or whatever it might be. That the people who are actually really invested in a question can't actually approach it in this way that we've always conceived of the drive to knowledge working. For somebody to be truly detached and dispassionate about the outcomes of a scientific experiment, they would have to not have any stake in that outcome or really care about that outcome. In some sense, again, he is just sort of arguing from definition, but I guess he's just working out sort of the kinks of his theory here, that there is no disinterested drive to knowledge, because somebody could come along and say, like, well, what about a career scientist? And he might say, well, perhaps they have a disinterested drive to knowledge, because the real drive that's interested and motivated is for their career, right? So the drive to knowledge isn't what's operative there, right? It's, again, being used instrumentally as a tool of some other interest. Next, in section 7, I'm going to skip over this one because we covered it in the Epicurus episode. But basically, he says, I'll paraphrase here what Nietzsche says. He says philosophers can be rather malicious, and he means this in sort of a tongue-in-cheek, playful way. And he says that Epicurus had a little sort of a mean joke against the Platonists and Plato, that he called them Dionysiokolakes, which means literally the flatterers of Dionysus, but it's also a common name for an actor at the time. And so he's saying this was a very malicious thing that Epicurus directed towards Plato because, and this is Nietzsche's allegation, I'll quote a little bit. He says, quote, "He was peeved by the grandiose manner, the mise en scène in which Plato and his disciples were so expert, at which Epicurus was not an expert. He, that little old schoolmaster from Samos who sat hidden away in his little garden at Athens and wrote 300 books, who knows, perhaps from rage and ambition against Plato." End quote. And so we covered that at least to some extent, but this is him including Epicurus, a philosopher Nietzsche has great respect for, even if he has his disagreements with him, and pointing out how even a philosopher like that, Nietzsche can psychologize about him and say, perhaps there was an immoral aim, that was the germ out of which Epicurus's philosophy grew, that perhaps his philosophy is all a great revenge against Plato. Platonism at that time is like it's the hot new thing. It's in the zeitgeist. It's what dominates the philosophical academy. And Epicurus has a completely, when Nietzsche says he was not an expert in the grand style of Plato, Plato's writing these dialogues that sort of mix all these styles of Greek art and literature, of like they're part drama, they're part comedic, they're part philosophical, they're part folklore, he blends all of these styles together, and he has these grand transcendental ideas about life. Meanwhile, Epicurus is this guy who advocates for the simple life, for the quietist life, for not going and getting involved in politics and political disputes, all of these ways of minimizing your exposure of yourself to meaningless suffering. That's not going to get you anywhere, right? And that's sort of his, he's this garden god, as Nietzsche calls him in this passage. He's the guy who advocates for the hidden life, for the apolitical life, for the life away from mass society or, ambition and striving and all of these things, right? And so Nietzsche's pointing out, is that his revenge against the philosopher who had achieved the top rank with all of these glittering illusions and this grand style? And so here's Epicurus advocating for quietism and simplicity. Well, then why do you have to write 300 books in favor of that ideology? Perhaps from rage and ambition against Plato. And so he can even do this new method of reorienting our understanding of a given philosophy by psychologizing about the philosopher based on what is driving him and then evaluating him from that standpoint. He can even do this with a figure like Epicurus that Nietzsche has great respect for. Section 8, very short section. Nietzsche says, quote, "There is a point in every philosophy when the philosopher's conviction appears on the stage, or to use the language of an ancient mystery, adventavit asinus, pulcher et fortissimus," end quote, which means the ass has arrived, beautiful and most brave. So when he says an ancient mystery, he means a mystery play. One of the mysteries in ancient Greece that you had the mystery that they were referring to in the most general possible terms would be something like the great mystery of existence. And so you had these cults that were called mystery cults. They would put on mystery plays, which were dramas, but they were sort of this was an elaboration on an ancient ritual that was supposed to reveal something to the attendants about the nature, something about the secret patterns or the nature of reality. And so in this drama, this mystery play, we have this phrase, the ass arrived, beautiful and most brave. So it's awfully mock heroic. And what is the metaphor here that Nietzsche is using when quoting this language from the ancient mystery plays? Well, the metaphor is the point in every philosopher when the philosopher's conviction appears on the stage. And so, to be vulgar, because Nietzsche's being a bit vulgar here, it's funny because we have a saying in English, showing your ass, right? That what the philosopher thinks he's doing is, perhaps it's the crescendo of his moral system, right? When he makes it clear what is truly driving his entire philosophy, but really he's just showing his ass. Really, Nietzsche is saying that in every philosopher's work you can find, and it is, I'm extrapolating here, I'm interpolating from what Nietzsche actually wrote because it's a very brief aphoristic section here. But the impression I get is that you can see this in the areas where philosophers are wrong, where they're like obviously wrong in their thinking, or where they have ideas that are just totally counterintuitive. That the parts when you're reading a philosopher and some idea just strikes you as completely strange, or like it's not warranted, like they just made a huge logical leap, and you're wondering why would they come to that conclusion. And oftentimes, in my experience, that's where you as the audience are perceiving you're sort of touching the moral or immoral germ out of which their philosophy is growing, where it becomes clear that there's just simply some demand that this philosopher has. And it's the fact that their logic kind of breaks down for you that sort of snatches away the veil for a moment on the fact that this isn't just a dispassionate, detached truth seeker that you're reading. This is somebody with an agenda, like we all have, right? And Nietzsche is pointing out the ways in which oftentimes this may be rather embarrassing to perceive, right? That we become embarrassed for the philosopher. There's something sort of, it's not quite shameful, but it's like a farcical about the entire thing, right? Okay, section 9. This is another passage we've covered in the past. And so we'll get into it again. Quote, "According to nature you want to live? Oh, you noble Stoics, what deceptive words these are. Imagine a being like nature, wasteful beyond measure, indifferent beyond measure, without purposes and consideration, without mercy and justice, fertile and desolate and uncertain at the same time. Imagine indifference itself as power. How could you live according to this indifference? Living, is that not precisely wanting to be other than this nature? Is not living estimating, preferring, being unjust, being limited, wanting to be different? And supposing your imperative, live according to nature, meant at bottom as much as live according to life, how could you not do that? Why make a principle of what you yourselves are and must be?" End quote. Okay, so he starts out, he's addressing the Stoics, but just in this first chunk of the text, this passage is very invaluable to us for understanding how Nietzsche himself thinks about nature. Indifferent beyond measure, indifference itself as power, without purposes and consideration, without mercy and justice, fertile and desolate and uncertain at the same time. That's what nature is. So Nietzsche's pointing out that we like to wax poetic about the nature of nature. Think of Mother Earth, right? This sort of image. Most people think in images, I think, when it comes to really abstract ideas. This is why I think Wittgenstein wavered on this between what the process of thinking actually looks like, because at a certain point he thinks it is like we think in pictures, like word pictures. I think that's the case, especially when it comes to the abstract, that we have to encapsulate it in kind of an image to really understand it. And so, because it's just like, how do you imagine just nature? And so the image we have, the popular image of Mother Nature or Mother Earth, is often, it's I would say the imagery is often warm. It often looks loving, because there's an agenda behind that picture, right? It's it's often the environmentalists who want to portray Mother Earth or Mother Nature, and they want us to have a loving, harmonious relationship with nature and the environment, right? So they're going to portray nature that way. They're not going to portray Mother Nature as Kali, devouring like with her tongue drooling blood and trampling on a corpse and with a necklace of heads. But that's perhaps an aspect of nature as well. I was going to say that's more like what nature is, but I think, as Nietzsche points out with this passage, the totality of everything we would consider quote-unquote nature is so vast and, as he says, fertile and desolate and uncertain at the same time, right? So, in some sense, our thought can't even encapsulate it. But in another very important sense, what we all are is living beings. And it's because he does have this conception of what life is, at least, right? And that life is estimating, preferring, being unjust, being limited, wanting to be different. So that's a very important point as well, that nature, what we're describing, is actually not a monism. That's why you can't actually encapsulate it in one image. It's an irreducible multiplicity. This is how Nietzsche thinks about, the world at large. That rather than the reality being that there are self-identical categories or sets of things, we have this like irreducible individuality and separateness and difference, and therefore conflict and strife. That's what describes the world, is all of these centers of will force at war with one another, in so many words. And so what do all these living things do? Well, they're all limited because they're trying to distinguish themselves from the other competing quantas of will force in the system, that it is by distinguishing yourself from drawing a distinction between yourself and others that you attain individuality. And so living is wanting to be different. It involves preference. He says being unjust here is an essential quality of living. Well, because all valuations in some sense are unjust, because you can't make a rational, objective argument for what you should value or prefer. Again, the most basic level, you can just say, well, this is just my physiological demand. This is just what I need on a physiological level, or what I seek on a physiological level. And, that's it. Even when it comes to the assessment of life itself, whether you say yes or no, you can't logically prove whether or not life is good or life is bad. And so what it means to be a living being is actually not to be part of this harmonious monism where you're absorbed back into the bosom of Mother Nature. What it means to be a living being is to be something which is different and distinguished from all other living beings and is therefore striving against all of them. That's what we actually see in nature, is this endless strife between organisms, the war of all against all. And so to say that you want to live according to nature, Nietzsche's saying, well, how could you not do that? Any way that you live as a living being, any way that you assert yourself, assert your pattern, a way of being against all the others, that is you living according to nature. You might as well say living according to life. How could you not do that? Why make a principle of what you are and must be? You're just adding on to it. But the truth is, and this is what he'll get into in the next paragraph, because again, he's addressing the Stoics. The truth is that the people who say things like, I want to live according to nature, have actually made a self-conception of nature, which is, if not monistic, it's one of those simplified images that can encapsulate the totality of nature and therefore focuses on some individual aspect of it, which would be according to what? It would be according to the moral or immoral ends that the person trying to describe nature is focused on. That's what they're going to see in nature. So, because truly living according to the indifference of the totality of the whole system of nature, this, the war of all, I want to live according to the principles of the war of all against all. That's not something that even really makes sense to some extent. You would go mad, right? So the only choice you have is to live according to life. But the Stoics are one of these groups who have they're imposing something upon nature. And Nietzsche explains it better in the following section, so we'll just continue. Quote, "In truth, the matter is altogether different. While you pretend rapturously to read the canon of your law and nature, you want something opposite, you strange actors and self-deceivers. Your pride wants to impose your morality, your ideal, on nature, even on nature, and incorporate them in her. You demand that she should be nature according to Stoa, and you would like all existence to exist only after your own image, as an immense eternal glorification and generalization of Stoicism. For all your love of truth, you have forced yourselves so long, so persistently, so rigidly, hypnotically to see nature the wrong way, namely stoically, that you are no longer able to see her differently. And some abysmal arrogance finally still inspires you with the insane hope that because you know how to tyrannize yourselves, Stoicism is self-tyranny, nature too lets herself be tyrannized. Is not the Stoic a piece of nature? But this is an ancient eternal story. What formerly happened with the Stoics still happens today too, as soon as any philosophy begins to believe in itself. It always creates the world in its own image. It cannot do otherwise. Philosophy is this tyrannical drive itself, the most spiritual will to power, to the creation of the world, to the causa prima." End quote. Given everything we've discussed, I think this is all fairly self-explanatory what he's saying here, but it's interesting just how he points out that the parallel between Stoicism as this self-tyranny. So, and we discussed this again, there's more information on this in the Epicurus episode because I wanted to contrast the Stoics with Epicureanism because it's not like a ideological disagreement that is terribly easy to grasp for a modern person because those schools of thought don't exist anymore to any real extent. But, well, I guess they do. They've just changed forms, but they don't, Anyway, this ancient eternal story, right? That is the really important thing here. The philosopher creates the world or he says philosophy creates the world in its own image. So the philosopher, the inspired mystic, right? Or the artist, somebody who has basically being driven by something that is not within his conscious rational control, is being used by this tyrannical drive. But philosophy, that's the interesting thing at the end of this section, that Nietzsche, it may not sound like he's giving credit to philosophy. It may sound very negative by calling it the tyrannical drive, the most spiritual will to power, the creation of the world. But it's fairly fascinating to me because it's almost, he is attributing some sort of power to philosophy. And of course he would, because, these philosophical recreations of the world. And when he says the causa prima, first cause, that's often used in the cosmological argument for God's existence, that God is the uncaused cause, the first cause that sets everything into motion. And so why do we think that about the world? Because that mirrors the way that philosophy creates the world within our thought. And these recreations of the world that philosophy has produced, they permeate the thought of entire cultures, and they shift and mutate until they become world religions that then completely redefine how millions of people see the world. And so there is actually a power to philosophy. It's the most spiritual will to power. That says a great deal about both the will to power and what Nietzsche thinks is actually going on with philosophy, that it is the most spiritual form. Spirit here, Geist, having the connotation of the intellect in German, that philosophy creates our quote-unquote spiritual worlds. And so the Stoics, as these, I kind of dropped this point earlier, I didn't fully articulate it. The Stoics, they're these people who self-tyrannize. They believe in mastering their passions. Again, a very common theme among philosophers. And a number of other things as well, but I don't want to go into an explication of Stoicism here. They then, they say that they're doing this in order to live according to nature, but what they do is recreate the world or, in other words, recreate nature in the image of their ideology, in this way that philosophy recreates the world. So it is a criticism of Stoicism, and oftentimes if you have a Nietzschean is going to debate with a Stoic, they rush to this passage because it's a really good, well-written passage, and you can use it to make all these accusations against Stoicism. But, the interesting thing is not the criticism of Stoicism in this passage. It's, again, it has so many layers to it. There's Nietzsche's conception of nature that we have, which is very important, but also the putting a very blunt, fine point on it, that philosophy is the creation of the world in one's own image. Okay, section 10. Quote, "The eagerness and subtlety, I might even say shrewdness, with which the problem of the real and apparent world is today attacked all over Europe makes one think and wonder, and anyone who hears nothing in the background except a will to truth certainly does not have the best of ears. In rare and isolated cases, it may really be the case that such a will to truth, some extravagant and adventurous courage, a metaphysician's ambition to hold a hopeless position, may participate and ultimately prefer even a handful of certainty to a whole carload of beautiful possibilities. There may actually be puritanical fanatics of conscience who prefer even a certain nothing to an uncertain something to lie down on and die. But this is nihilism, and a sign of a despairing, mortally weary soul, however courageous the gestures of such a virtue may look." End quote. Okay, so the problems of the real and the apparent world. We should all be familiar with this. It's the topic of the first episode of the Nietzsche podcast. It's that old division between the true world and the world of appearances. And he says, the problem is attacked all over Europe. So this idea of the phenomenological noumena split, this idea that we really know nothing about the quote-unquote objective world as such, for whatever that might even mean, because we all live in our nervous systems, we live inside of our heads, we have no experience of the world outside of our sensations, that has dominated European thought, not just for centuries before Nietzsche, with figures like Kant, but even leading up to his own time. And we've talked about how Nietzsche was very interested in the work of scientists and philosophers of science of the neo-Kantian school who were still very much concerned with this question. But he says, even this, so this desire to bridge the gap between the real and the apparent world, or to comprehend, what this division truly means, to understand what we can know of the real world from our knowledge of the phenomenal. So all of these questions, he says, anyone who hears just a will to truth in all of this doesn't have the best of ears. And his reasoning for this is that even those, and I love his phrasing here, and I've used it many times, because what he describes is sort of like the terminally skeptic position, right? We all know somebody like this. Somebody who gets into solipsism or one of these ideologies where, like, how can we know anything, man? It's sort of the types of positions that people take, especially when they're very early getting into philosophy, and that, quite frankly, are the things that people make fun of in the popular consciousness when they bring to mind what a philosopher is. The philosopher is the person who doesn't even know that, reality exists, and what even is reality, right? So the kind of person who's willing to part with all certainty, part with a whole carload of beautiful possibilities, and who might even prefer a certain nothing to an uncertain something. So I think that really perfectly describes what's happening. But Nietzsche's pointing out, or a certain type of person, a certain phase that certain people go through in philosophy. But what Nietzsche's pointing out, that this is not actually the product of somebody taking through a dispassionate will to truth, a courageous desire to just hold to nothing but the truth to the very end, right? Nietzsche's saying that's not what's happening here. If somebody's rejecting the entire world as essentially false and saying, I can't be certain of anything, I'd rather be certain of nothing than embrace any degree of falsehood and be deceived, that's just a statement of the person's own nihilism. And you could say that that's just an ad hominem attack, but I don't think you can get around that with an argument or with that type of argument of saying it's just an ad hominem attack. Like, you actually don't have any true certainty, absolute certainty in the physical world or something like that. I think to make an argument that Nietzsche might advance, yeah, but we all care about things in this physical world that is quote unquote illusory, right? We have friends and family and loved ones and, artistic projects and things that we care about in life. And so if you care about those things, then it becomes real enough to you to some extent. And then this kind of like metaphysical questioning, to the point of questioning the entire world, your entire reality to death, with this like extreme skepticism, that can't actually hold water for you. Because to the extent that you do care about the things of the world, it makes them real enough to be motivating of your actions. And so this just would become empty metaphysical speculation. To the extent that somebody actually denies the existence of the entire world, somebody like Schopenhauer, right? It's just evidence of the fact that they're actually a nihilistic person. And therefore they're doing philosophy from the perspective of that nihilism. Their despair is what's driving their philosophy. So we'll continue with the passage. Quote, "It seems, however, to be otherwise with stronger and livelier thinkers who are still eager for life. When they side against appearance and speak of perspective with a new arrogance, when they rank the credibility of their own bodies about as low as the credibility of the visual evidence that the earth stands still, and thus, apparently in good humor, let their securest possession go. For in what does one at present believe more firmly than in one's own body? Who knows if they are not trying at bottom to win back something that was formerly an even securer possession, something of the ancient domain of the faith of former times? Perhaps the immortal soul, perhaps the old God, in short, ideas by which one could live better, that is to say, more vigorously and cheerfully than by modern ideas." End quote. So, this is where things start to get a little bit complex with Nietzsche's thinking. I mean, at times, when you break down what he's saying, I begin to feel, especially over repeated exposure to the ideas, that I'm like, is this almost just too obvious on the face of it? But then you get to a passage like this, where Nietzsche is very much self-aware of the fact that he might appear to be standing against appearance when he speaks of perspective. What does that mean? Well, we covered this a bit in the previous episode, that to acknowledge perspective, to acknowledge that your reality that you live in is not the objective reality, is in some sense to side, quote unquote, against appearance, because you're saying the appearances which constitute my reality are not necessarily, quote unquote, reality as such, that old phenomenal noumenal split emerges again just as a consequence of perspectivism. And this is why this is sort of like a philosophical bugbear that's never going to go away. But notice there's sort of Nietzsche, we can tell that he is speaking at least somewhat approvingly of this kind of skepticism, insofar as he's bringing up, that they're doing this apparently in good humor. There's a sort of exuberance, a sort of, what would you say, like the laughing bravery of the dashing knave, right? As they let their own body go, as they count the evidence of their own body as low as the visual evidence that the earth stands still. I mean, what does that mean? It's simply pointing out one way in which our perspective on the world is that the earth stands still. It's not that we're on a revolving globe whirling through space. It's only through the accumulation of millennia of scientific knowledge that we could come to that sort of understanding. But that's why, for most of human history, we believe that the earth stands still. And that was actually technically wrong, right? But it's wrong only in the sense of the objective world. It's not wrong in the sense that this is actually what we experience from our perspective. And that we can't, this is a great way to hammer home that perspective is not like just your arbitrary choices or preferences, like that you make on a whim, that you don't have a choice whether you perceive the earth as standing still or not. right? That it's not your like intelligent, rational decision to believe that. It's simply your honest perception as you live it. And so Nietzsche is, again, would seem to be raising perhaps a problem from his own position by approving of this kind of skepticism, of the very project that he's putting forward to understand perspective and see all of our truths as irreducibly human. You're letting go of certainties that previously people would have said are most secure certainties, in some sense. Like that I can believe what I see with my own eyes. Nietzsche, in some sense, is saying we can't believe what we see with our own eyes, right? But it's interesting that he says maybe they're trying to claw back the immortal soul or the old God, these ideas by which one could live better. That is to say, more vigorously and cheerfully than by modern ideas. And as I've suggested, I think this is a hint that Nietzsche is giving us, that he's not trying to claw these things back in the sense that perhaps Kant was doing, right? Making reason the governor of all human action, in the sense that, the word and the logos and God's law, his moral law, upon us men as thinking beings set apart from the animal kingdom. Maybe we can get that back through a strictly rational philosophy of living by moral and rational laws. But what Nietzsche is doing is seeing the ways in which ideas like the God of Christendom was a motivating thing for mankind, was the receptacle of our valuing. And the immortal soul also had a similar effect. And so perhaps there is a way to find the same motivation or valuing, to look for something like that by which we could live better, right? But it's very difficult to actually say in this passage why Nietzsche thinks that this one form of skepticism he's describing and that he's following in his pursuit of truth in this book is somehow different from that first kind of accepting a certain nothing instead of an uncertain something. And this is one of those answers that may dissatisfy you, but I think Nietzsche would simply say the instincts that are driving the person, right? He's saying, I detect something stronger and livelier in this viewpoint, which is based on perspective, than I do in the sort of like solipsistic, ultimate skepticism that we all stereotype the first-year philosophy student as having. That it doesn't necessarily, that we shouldn't evaluate them on the level of testing their ideas against one another. We should sort of test their instincts against one another. You can take that or leave it, but that is Nietzsche's approach. So then he says, quote, there is a mistrust of these modern ideas in this attitude, a disbelief in all that has been constructed yesterday and today. There is perhaps some slight admixture of satiety and scorn. I'm going to skip down a little bit here. In this, it seems to me, we should agree with these skeptical anti-realists and knowledge microscopists of today. Their instinct, which repels them from modern reality, is unrefuted. What do their retrograde bypaths concern us? The main thing about them is not that they wish to go back, but that they wish to get away. A little more strength, flight, courage, and artistic power, and they would want to rise, not return. End quote. And so the main point at the end of this passage, like there's still the current crop of philosophers, they're not quite there yet. And this is why Nietzsche is hoping for philosophers to come in the future to fulfill his aims, that many of the people like Nietzsche who are calling into question the ideas about reality that come on the heels of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, many of them end up as, reactionaries who want to return society to an earlier time. Maybe perhaps they find there is no way to claw back the old God in this new world, and so we must simply return to tradition. We've all seen that meme in recent years. And in some way he's saying, look, what's admirable about them is not where they want to go, that they want to go back, because such a thing is not possible. It's that they want to get away from modernity, which is, in Nietzsche's view, hopelessly dogmatic and in many ways worse than the irrational and unquestioned dogmas of past eras. That at least, perhaps with these old religions, they recognize themselves as religions, unlike many of the attitudes that were arising in Nietzsche's day, which we should all be familiar with by now, of sort of like positivism, scientific realism, and all of these more moral ideas of modernity that people just sort of accept as like, well, that's just the truth, right? Well, that's just the right thing to do. Whereas, in the past, there was like a self-identity associated with the dogma and a conscious identification with this dogma and an unquestioning nature to it. And anyway, I won't get into Nietzsche's general critique of modernity, but in general, he thinks it's something we have to move beyond. And so he doesn't like that they want to go back, but he does like that they want to get away. And so that's why he's hoping for the philosophers of the future to want to rise and not return. Very important turn of phrase that he uses there for understanding what Nietzsche's aiming at. So, section 11. This section, I'm going to skip it, and not because it's not incredibly important, but because I did a deep dive on this section on the episode on the congenital defect of philosophers. So I know I brought that episode up the last time, or in the first episode, but if you want a deep dive on this section, I believe it comes toward the end of the episode. The key thing in this passage is that we have that question of synthetic knowledge a priori that Nietzsche makes reference to earlier in the text. So Kant has this idea that in order to solve the problems of epistemology, in other words, the question of how we know what we know, you could account for human knowledge being certain of what we know with this idea of a synthetic knowledge a priori, which means a priori meaning knowledge that you have prior to any experience. So we're born with this knowledge, and yet it's synthetic. Synthetic meaning you bringing together of two things in your mind, right? We don't need to get too deeply into what all of this means. I do dive more deeply into that in the congenital defect of philosophers episode. The reason why this is important is that Kant's question is, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? Because it's kind of counterintuitive, right? And he comes to the conclusion it's by virtue of a faculty. And when you think about the turn of phrase, by virtue of a faculty, as Nietzsche points out, you could say by virtue of a virtue, right? A faculty, that just means some aspect or trait or quality that you have. In the same sense, that's what a faculty means, right? And so in some ways, it's just a bald-faced assertion to say by virtue of a faculty. We have some faculty that allows us to make synthetic judgments a priori, which simply is just defining it into existence. You're saying there's just human beings just have the ability to do this, right? And he says then, the honeymoon of German philosophy arrived and everyone went out looking to find faculties, and that they didn't do a sufficient job of understanding that they were blurring the lines between finding and inventing. And that in German, finden and erfinden, those two words, finding and inventing, are cognates? So they come from the same root word. And so Nietzsche says, again, it's high time to replace the Kantian question, quote, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible, by another question, why is belief in such judgments necessary? And so what he's bringing to our attention there is this defining into existence of a faculty that we have for the sake of being able to know with certainty things of which we have no experience, just, the state of being a blank slate. This was necessary to Kant for the moral ends that his philosophy was serving. And that you could say the question of how are synthetic judgments a priori possible, by virtue of a faculty. That's the philosopher's conviction arriving on stage. the ass arriving beautiful and most brave. And I think actually this is a great example of what Nietzsche means in that kind of enigmatic section 8, is the example of Kant and his synthetic judgments a priori, because he says the entire thing reminds him of a scene in Molière, which is a play. What is it? Quia est in eo virtus dormitiva, cujus est natura sensus assupere. And what that is that it's a reply of the doctor to another character who's explaining how this concoction works. And he says it puts you to sleep because it contains a sleepy faculty whose nature it is to put the senses to sleep, right? So we synthetic judgments a priori are possible because we have a synthetic judgments a priori faculty whose nature it is to allow us to perceive synthetic judgments a priori. There, it's solved, right? And Nietzsche is pointing out that's comedic, it's farcical, right? And so that's the farcical nature of the philosopher's conviction arriving on the stage. So skipping over any reading from that passages because you can get it in another episode in more detail. Next, we have section 12, which we touched on in the episode on Nietzschean science. Quote, as for materialistic atomism, it is one of the best refuted theories there are, and in Europe perhaps no one in the learned world is now so unscholarly as to attach serious significance to it except for convenient household use, as abbreviation of the means of expression, thanks chiefly to the Dalmatian Boscovich. He and the Pole Copernicus have been the greatest and most successful opponents of visual evidence so far. For while Copernicus has persuaded us to believe, contrary to all the senses, that the earth does not stand fast, Boscovich has taught us to abjure the belief in the last part of the earth that stood fast, the belief in substance, in matter, in the earth residuum and particle atom. It is the greatest triumph over the senses that has been gained on earth so far. End quote. So, again, when Nietzsche's talking about a triumph over the senses, he's talking about this triumph of his new approach of perspective, of extrapolating what one's senses are and the apparent world, the world of appearance, into this universal dogmatism, right? What he defined as dogmatism in the first section. That's what gaining a triumph over the senses means here. So again, it may seem confusing because you might be like, what? Isn't Nietzsche all for the world of the senses? Yes, but with the realization that our senses are not providing us with the universally applicable truths of an objective world. It's very subtle what Nietzsche's project is, right? When we get into the details as he sort of lays them out here in Beyond Good and Evil. Now, so we talked a lot about Boscovich in that episode and Copernicus, but his explanation of Copernicus, I think, is very explanatory, especially given the fact that he drew on the idea that the Earth does not stand still in previous section, because obviously Copernicus is the one who tells us that the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. But Boscovich is this physicist who and philosopher of science who comes up with this single mathematical equation for describing how all forces in the physical world operate. And it's based on this idea of action at a distance, which, we won't get into here. But in a sense, what Boscovich's theory allows us to do is to see things like particles or atoms as, rather than being, because in Boscovich, atoms are non-corpuscular and they're non-extended, if I remember correctly. So in so many words, I'm just going to try and skip over several steps of this argument. If you really accept like Boscovichian physics, which Nietzsche seems to do in this passage and especially in his notes, particles aren't a substance. They're not actually like the substrate of reality. When we break down, it's a very bizarre belief when you think about it. Like, we keep breaking down matter into smaller and smaller parts, and the smaller the parts, the more fundamental they are. Well, why does that follow? That doesn't follow at all. In fact, it's the type of thinking that you would only apply if you were thinking that the universe was like built from more basic building blocks. That's often how we talk about matter, right? Is like we have smaller and smaller building blocks, right? Like we were put together like Legos or whatever. But if you consider that reality, if you consider reality not as something that was intelligently designed or consciously directed or has some sort of teleology for it, it's actually a very bizarre idea to think that the smaller units of matter somehow get you closer to understanding the basics of reality, right? That what if that is not the relevant scale of matter to consider to really understand matter? And so what Nietzsche is really attacking here is this idea to believe in, because like going all the way back to Democritus, there's this idea of the atom, of the smallest possible particle of matter that is indivisible. You can't get anything smaller, right? And so that would then offer you something like substance, I suppose, is why people look for smaller and smaller particles. Because once you hit bedrock and you're like, this is the smallest thing, then you can say that is what everything is, and you can say that is the substance because it's indivisible. That gives you a thing that can't be divided into other things, right? And so if you were to find something that is truly indivisible, that really is what Nietzsche is criticizing when he's criticizing atomism. He's not criticizing the idea that people read this passage today and they're like, well, Nietzsche was wrong because we can look at an electron microscope and see atoms. It's like, that is not an atom the way Democritus spoke of an atom, because an atom's indivisible. And atoms as we know them, they initially may have thought they found something like what Democritus was talking about, but you can divide them into protons, neutrons, and electrons. And then you can find quarks beneath that and Planck particles and all of these things. We have never hit the bedrock of finding what is the indivisible substrate on which all matter is built out of. The reason it would be very important for it to be indivisible is because that would be something that stands still or stands fast. That would be something essential, right? It would be something that is self-identical, enduring. All of these things that Nietzsche basically says don't actually exist in nature in the phenomenal world, that only exist as conceptions, basically. It's sort of the hunt to actually find that in physical nature. That's what science is doing with what he calls in the following paragraph, an atomistic need, right? To find the thing that's indivisible, to then prove that matter is something solid, it's something enduring, something we can comprehend in the language of, rational, conscious, philosophical thought, which partakes of the unconditioned and self-identical. But what we see in nature is that we don't have anything that's unconditioned and self-identical. And the reason is because nothing is divisible from the environment around it. You're not divisible from the air you breathe, right? You take the organism out of the air it breathes and it dies. So that means that the living organism, at least, can't be separated from the entire atmosphere and all of the processes and things that go into that. And on and on and on through the entire natural physical world. So that's really what he's criticizing. And so to continue with this passage quote, one must, however, go still further and also declare war, relentless war unto death against the atomistic need, which still leads a dangerous afterlife in places where no one suspects it, just like the more celebrated metaphysical need. One must also, first of all, give the finishing stroke to that other and more calamitous atomism, which Christianity has taught best and longest, the soul atomism. Let it be permitted to designate by this expression the belief which regards the soul as something indestructible, eternal, indivisible, as a monad, as an atomon. This belief ought to be expelled from science. End quote. So there you go. He comes right out and says it. Really, the nature of atomism isn't like trying to just like explain reality by breaking things into smaller parts. That's not what he's criticizing. He's criticizing the search for something in nature which is indestructible, eternal, indivisible as a monad. And what he says is, so that's why this atomistic need is very similar to a metaphysical need, because they're looking for in the natural world through the pursuit of science, something which they used to have in metaphysics. And furthermore, the soul atomism, as Nietzsche is describing it, isn't like breaking the soul into smaller particles. It's seeing the soul itself as an atom, an atomon, something indivisible. So the self, one's identity, as an atom, whereas Nietzsche doesn't think that that's what we are at all. Again, we are these rank-ordered bundles of drives, and that are not, it's not something stable and static and self-identical, that actually what we contain within the concept of the self, or not the concept, but what is actually contained within our self-identity, regardless of how we conceptualize about it, includes things that are mutually exclusive. And that oftentimes what the self consists of and what we are shifts and changes. It becomes rather than simply is. So back to the passage. Quote, between ourselves, it is not at all necessary to get rid of the soul at the same time, and thus renounce one of the most ancient and venerable hypotheses, as happens frequently to clumsy naturalists who can hardly touch on the soul without immediately losing it. But the way is open for new versions and refinements of the soul hypothesis, and such conceptions as mortal soul, and soul as subjective multiplicity, and soul as social structure of the drives and affects, want henceforth to have citizens' rights in science. End quote. So that's exactly what I was just bringing up. All of those ideas are different pictures of the self-identity, which are not essentialist and static, based on this view of being rather than becoming. We'll finish the passage. Quote, when the new psychologist puts an end to the superstitions which have so far flourished with almost tropical luxuriance around the idea of the soul, he practically exiles himself into a new desert and new suspicion. It is possible that the older psychologists had a merrier and more comfortable time of it. Eventually, however, he finds that precisely thereby he also condemns himself to invention, and who knows, perhaps to discovery. End quote. So I just wanted to go to the end of that line because it's a callback to what he was saying about Kant, how everyone was then looking for new faculties, right? And confusing the fact they weren't discovering new faculties, they were inventing them in the same way that Kant had to invent his faculty, because it was necessary to him and the way that he had recreated the world. So what's interesting is that Nietzsche is saying we're condemning ourselves to become inventors of these new concepts out of need, out of our own necessity, because we are going to be forced into it by the fact that our new conception of the world is so strange and so anathema to everything that's come before, because the way that people think is still caught in these moral and metaphysical dogmas, often in ways they're not even aware of. We'll have to become the inventors ourselves, but he says perhaps we'll even begin to make actual discoveries, which again, it's worth bringing up that Nietzsche is himself a philosopher here, and it's not as if he thinks he's not an irrationalist in the sense that he doesn't think that there's any truths that you could discover from philosophy. You could actually discover about human nature or the world. It's simply that, what do we mean when we say those are truths? What and what did we do to pursue those truths? The way we think about those truths, it's completely redefined in light of everything he's laid out. 13, quote, physiologists should think before putting down the instinct of self-preservation as the cardinal instinct of an organic being. A living thing seeks above all to discharge its strength. Life itself is will to power. Self-preservation is only one of the indirect and most frequent results. In short, here as everywhere else, let us beware of superfluous teleological principles, one of which is the instinct of self-preservation. We owe it to Spinoza's inconsistency. Thus, method, which must be essentially economy of principles, demands it. End quote. So, Spinoza, he says his inconsistency. So, Spinoza is Nietzsche's great precursor. There's much that's valuable about Spinoza. Kaufman points out Spinoza's critique of teleology. What he's referring to here is Spinoza's belief that from which Schopenhauer gets his idea of will to live, his idea of conatus, which is the will of living beings to exist, we might say. And something like this principle has permeated philosophical thought going all the way back to the Greeks, because, and what Nietzsche would say is that what they're doing is they're trying to in the same way that Kant says by virtue of a faculty, like how do you say that individual phenomena, quote unquote, exist when they're not indivisible, right? When you see an organism walking around in the forest and it seems to be this, separate, distinct thing, and then it dies, and then what happens? It gets absorbed again by the environment around it. It becomes indistinguishable from the soil and the maggots that eat it, and so on and so forth. Or, the way in which you could say, you could look at the phenomenon of a single roach in your house and say, well, that's just, one roach. That's just one distinct organism. But it would be a really foolish way to think about it. Any rational person, if they see a roach in their house, knows that where there's one, there's going to be more because they like to come in and breed, right? So organisms, living things, they give rise to something beyond themselves. They don't just seek to preserve themselves. That's not the essential character of life. And so that covers sort of the beginning of the passage. Self-preservation is just a frequent result of the fact that what the living organism is trying to do is discharge its strength. So that could involve giving rise to offspring beyond itself, but also to, Nietzsche would of course bring up like predation and the predator's desire to, to the predatory need to nourish oneself on lesser life forms is another version of this. This is where elsewhere he says that reproduction, and I think it's elsewhere in this text, we're going to get to it in a later section, where he says reproduction and nourishment are the same problem in biology, right? And so he sees reproduction and nourishment as sort of more two sides of the same coin, more indicative of the will to power, which he uses explicitly to say life itself is will to power in this passage. That self-preservation, he makes it a secondary phenomenon here. It's actually, in many ways, runs contrary to what the will to power might be or what it might demand of an organism. I mean, examples we might have, like salmon swimming upriver so that they can spawn and completely destroying their bodies in the process. They spawn and then they die. So that's a vision of life as essentially trying to give rise to something beyond itself, rather than preserve itself as it is. And it was Spinoza's inconsistency, in spite of his brilliance, of asserting this principle whereby things could just be and exist. Everything just has a will to exist and continue existing. That's how there are things. But really, that is simply an unwillingness to see the reality of becoming. That is the actual character of life and existence, not static being. Nietzsche in section 14 writes, quote, "It is perhaps just dawning on 5 or 6 minds that physics, too, is only an interpretation and exegesis of the world, to suit us, if I may say so, and not a world explanation. But insofar as it is based on the belief in the senses, it is regarded as more, and for a long time must be regarded as more, namely as an explanation. Eyes and fingers speak in its favor. Visual evidence and palpableness do too. This strikes an age with fundamentally plebeian tastes as fascinating, persuasive, and convincing. After all, it follows instinctively the canon of truth of eternally popular sensualism. What is clear? What is explained? Only what can be seen and felt. Every problem has to be pursued to that point. Conversely, the charm of the Platonic way of thinking, which was a noble way of thinking, consisted precisely in resistance to obvious sense evidence. Perhaps among men who enjoyed even stronger and more demanding senses than our contemporaries, but who knew how to find a higher triumph in remaining masters of their senses. And this by means of pale, cold, gray concept nets, which they threw over the motley whirl of the senses, the mob of the senses, as Plato said. In this overcoming of the world, an interpreting of the world in the manner of Plato, there was an enjoyment different from that which the physicists of today offer us, and also the Darwinists and anti-teleologists among the workers in physiology with their principle of the smallest possible force and the greatest possible stupidity. Where man cannot find anything to see or to grasp, he has no further business. That is certainly an imperative different from the Platonic one, but it may be the right imperative for a tough, industrious race of machinists and bridge builders of the future who have nothing but rough work to do." End quote. So what's particularly interesting about this passage is the way in which Plato has been called out in the very preface as one of the main targets of this work, right? Because he's a dogmatist. He's a man who introduced universal dogmatic philosophy into the Western mind in some sense. And he's responsible for so many of these metaphysical errors that Nietzsche thinks have really led us astray. But in the same way that he doesn't think we should be ungrateful to those errors, he can also give a fairly charitable assessment of Plato here. And he points out how the mob of the senses, as Plato says, right? Remember the tripartite view of the self from Plato's Republic, that the drives or desires are sort of seen like this, this tangle of beasts that reason has to master over, and marshal one's courage and one's sort of inner spirit in order to bring that into line in a way that mirrors the sort of classes of society that Plato wants to bring about. The three classes of society, where you have the philosopher ruler and then the soldiers beneath him enforcing the dictates of reason, and then this is upon the mass of people, the mob, right? Nietzsche correctly points out this is a noble way of thinking. So Plato is an aristocratic elitist, just like Nietzsche, and his philosophy mirrors that. And what he's pointing out is the way in which it's very fascinating, because he's still psychologizing in the same way that he's done throughout this passage, showing the ways in which Plato's philosophy, his entire recreation of the world, springs from this desire, potentially, we might say one of the things that it springs from, to overcome the world, the physical world, the world of appearance, recognizing that the world of appearances, of the sense organs, the world of the senses, is the world of desires, earthly desires, drives, wants, those things that philosophers are always trying to master, right? And so accordingly, associating yourself with the otherworldly or the transcendent, that which transcends this world, inventing this world of the forms, and he's sort of like marveling at the courage of Plato, the ingenuity of Plato, with this pale, cold gray concept net, right? This is a time when philosophy is a new, strange thing, and where our ability for complex philosophical system building was not very well developed. And so Plato takes this philosophical system, nevertheless, and sets it against, again, like the truth we can see with our very eyes. What daring, right? To be able to deny the world that we see with our very eyes as an expression of one believing in the nobility of the intellect and the fact that this world of the intellect and the abstract should be elevated above this paltry, vulgar, turmoil of delusion and lust that this world is, right? That there is something essentially aristocratic about Plato's view. And again, for Nietzsche, not a strike against Plato. And in a way, he's comparing the viewpoint, we might say that just the common sense view of the average person, that what can be seen and felt is the only thing worth explaining, right? He's pointing out how this is completely opposite to what he calls the sort of the charm for him of Platonic thinking. And it's part and parcel with something, you might call it like vulgar, just sort of that there is something very commonplace and very mean about it. And that this is what's driving all of physics. But the important thing at the beginning of the passage is that he says it's just dawning on 5 or 6 minds in physics. It's sort of a famously enigmatic line, and I won't go into like theories about like who he's talking about, because, in some sense it doesn't matter. It's just another one of Nietzsche's predictions that, these truths that he's grasping at here are going to come into the zeitgeist with fuller force at some future time. But that the understanding that physics itself, the mathematical models and the structures that we create through mentation for explaining how the physical world works, are not themselves what would you say? He says it's only an interpretation and exegesis of the world and not a world explanation. Again, it comes back to this fundamental issue of perspective and the awareness that the world of the senses in which we live is not this objective world, and that we're not coming any closer to universal truths by grasping at the world through the sciences. We're just coming through to a more sophisticated model of the world as appearance. Now, Nietzsche affirms the world as appearance, right? Totally. But he is trying to walk this tightrope of reminding us that what we do live in is the world as appearance, which means it's a world of perspective, right? Which has all these sort of terrifying possibilities to it, without denying that world then on that account and grasping for this objective universal truth. Because, again, that's something, in some sense, it's beyond our capacities as the human. It's misunderstanding what truth is for us, right? Which is, as living beings, indelibly perspectival. So sort of a reiteration of the same point, but the comments about Plato, I think, are particularly interesting because he almost sees what Plato's doing as like laudable from one perspective. It's Plato as artist, right? Plato and Socrates, famously anti-artistic philosophers who challenge all the superstitions and dogmas as doing something artistic and creating a new illusion, right? This whole world of the forms is their artistic, illusory creation. And that was all completely wrong. But that's not what, the fact that it was wrong, the falseness of a judgment is not a argument against that judgment. But nevertheless, Plato is it's not that he arrived at the world of the forms through dispassionate reason. That's the other big issue, right? 15, quote, "To study physiology with a clear conscience, one must insist that the sense organs are not phenomena in the sense of idealistic philosophy. As such, they could not be causes. Sensualism, therefore, at least as a regulative hypothesis, if not as a heuristic principle. What, and others even say that the external world is the work of our organs. But then our body, as a part of this external world, would be the work of our organs. But then our organs themselves would be the work of our organs. It seems to me that this is a complete reductio ad absurdum, assuming that the concept of a causa sui is something fundamentally absurd. Consequently, the external world is not the work of our organs?" And it's worth pointing out, he ends this passage with a question mark. Sorry, end quote. So, the causa sui, cause unto itself, he's saying, assuming that is something that's fundamentally absurd. So the way that Nietzsche approaches this is very interesting. It's almost like he's not willing to take these logical laws for granted himself. There's like a wink and a smile here. He's like, you and I both know these are just conventions of our thinking, which would follow from the things that he's pointed out. So then he's using the conventions of our thinking, the laws of logic, as we think they are unimpeachable, unchallengeable, saying, well, okay, according to the things that we claim to believe in, we can't have like a reduction to absurdity in our arguments, that an uncaused cause, a self-caused cause, is something fundamentally absurd. It's like Baron Munchausen pulling himself up by his bootstraps, right? Something impossible that you can't do. You can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's sort of what the self-caused cause is. Well, that's fundamentally absurd. And if that's the case, you know, if you're one of these people who's completely skeptical and completely doubts everything in the world, you would be forced to say that the idea that that your sense organs are the work of your sense organs, that statement eats itself. So that's why he says, to study physiology with a clear conscience, we have to insist that the sense organs are not phenomena in the sense of idealistic philosophy. As such, they could not be causes. So, idealistic philosophy is to say, to basically say that phenomena are not quote-unquote real. I mean, idealism in the strict sense, and the strong sense, the Berkeleyan sense, is to say that everything that's truly real is an idea, or in the sense that Plato thought of, like the forms, that this is the only real world, and the phenomenal is at best a sort of deception, right? It might appear real, but it doesn't actually correspond to anything real. He's saying that our sense organs themselves, not the product, not our, what would you say, not the sensory data, not the things that we're perceiving, but the thing by which you perceive, so your faculty of hearing, your faculty of sight, these things themselves can't be illusions. All of the sensory data that you're receiving could be potentially illusory. But that point of contact of you, whatever you are, with the broader world, this faculty, whether it's a physical organ or not, right? That can't be illusory. That is something real. And so a lot of this may seem fairly straightforward. I get tired of saying this, but something very fascinating in what Nietzsche is doing here, because like, as we talked about in the Schopenhauer episode, so Schopenhauer goes back to the will. That's the thing he sees as fundamental. Or you could imagine the intellect or your consciousness, like Descartes. I think, therefore I am. That's the starting point, right? What's Nietzsche doing here? He's sort of taking us to a place where the sense organs are the starting point. The sense organs themselves can't be the work of our organs. So, because that idea eats itself. He still has a question mark at the end, because he doesn't want to raise an assertion about the objective world, because that would be dogmatic. Because ultimately we don't really know if we take this strict, hard-boiled skepticist view. Why? Because it would be a reduction to absurdity. And that's why there's still a question mark at the end, because it's like, I'm just following the conventions of logic, which these are not by any means assured. These are just conventions. In some sense, his entire premise is based on challenging, for example, the law of non-contradiction, that something can't be itself and not itself at the same place and the same time. He would say all things are both themselves and not themselves at the same place and the same time. So he's already thrown out the entire law of non-contradiction by his whole project of going beyond good and evil and showing the mutual, not exclusivity, but inclusivity of opposites, which completely detonates like our whole logical systems. So that's not like a certainty that he's coming to, I guess, is the meaning of that question mark at the end of this. But he's taking us through on our own logic and saying basically that if you want to follow that logic and try and gain some sort of quote-unquote objective certainty about the world, it's not permissible to say that our sense organs are themselves an illusion, because that wouldn't make any sense. And therefore, he looks at sensation. I would say this is my extrapolation of this passage based on the rest of what I've read of Nietzsche. My interpolation here is that he's making sensation the starting point, in the way that Descartes makes the intellect the starting point, or Schopenhauer makes will the starting point. And that's why physiology, instinct, impulse, all of these things are primary for Nietzsche, and then the intellect, or the outward manifestation of our desires and in the form of our individual will or whatever it might be, these are all secondary to the fundamental truth of physiology. And so, for whatever the physical world might be, we are embodied beings within that physical world. Meaning we are actually, it's that commitment to multiplicity and difference in Nietzsche, right? That we're all living beings that are distinct and strive to be different. That's what life is. And thus to be embodied, that's sort of like without drawing on materialistic atomism, right? And the notion that we have to be indivisible, truly indivisible in some sort of sense of being. Instead, in the sense of becoming, right? We are first and foremost bodies. We're sensing beings, we might say. Because in some sense, that's what it means to be embodied, is to experience oneself as this locus of feelings, not thoughts or, will to live, which he's rejected in one of the previous sections. So in the following section in 16, I think this lends credence to my argument that this is exactly what Nietzsche is doing in the previous section, is sort of setting us up or subtly implying the primacy of sensation or feeling, because he immediately then calls to mind these other experiments in doing this very thing, which were Schopenhauer and Descartes. And what is contained in this passage is perhaps the best interrogation of I think, therefore I am that exists. And so even though I talked about this in the Descartes episode, I'll just read this whole section again. Quote, "There are still harmless self-observers who believe that there are immediate certainties. For example, I think, or as the superstition of Schopenhauer put it, I will, as though knowledge here got hold of its object purely and nakedly as the thing in itself, without any falsification on the part of either the subject or the object. But that immediate certainty, as well as absolute knowledge, and the thing in itself involve a contradictio ad objecto. I shall repeat 100 times, we really ought to free ourselves from the seduction of words. Let the people suppose that knowledge means knowing things entirely. The philosopher must say to himself, when I analyze the process that is expressed in the sentence, I think, I find a whole series of daring assertions that would be difficult, perhaps impossible to prove. For example, that it is I who think, that there must necessarily be something that thinks, that thinking is an activity and operation on the part of a being who is thought of as a cause, that there is an ego, and finally, that it is already determined what is to be designated by thinking, that I know what thinking is. For if I had not already decided within myself what it is, by what standard could I determine whether that which is just happening is not perhaps willing or feeling? In short, the assertion I think assumes that I compare my state at the present moment with other states of myself which I know, in order to determine what it is. On account of this retrospective connection with further knowledge, it has at any rate no immediate certainty for me. In place of the immediate certainty, in which the people may believe in the case at hand, the philosopher thus finds a series of metaphysical questions presented to him, truly searching questions of the intellect, to wit, from where do I get the concept of thinking? Why do I believe in cause and effect? What gives me the right to speak of an ego, and even of an ego as cause, and finally of an ego as the cause of thought? Whoever ventures to answer these metaphysical questions at once by an appeal to a sort of intuitive perception, like the person who says, I think, and know that this at least is true, actual, and certain, will encounter a smile and 2 question marks from a philosopher nowadays. Sir, the philosopher will perhaps give him to understand, it is improbable that you are not mistaken, but why insist on the truth? End quote. So, wonderful things in this passage. At the beginning, when you think you have an immediate certainty, he links together the idea of immediate certainty with absolute knowledge and the thing in itself. He says these are all concepts which can be reduced to the absurd for all the reasons that we've talked about, that in fact, this is an attempt to get back to a truth that has dropped from the lap of being. He says the idea as though knowledge got hold of its object purely and nakedly as the thing in itself, without any falsification on part of either the subject or the object. So he's just simply saying that is absurd in and of itself for all the reasons that we've talked about, that we're not disinterested truth seekers, so we never get a hold of it. And the idea of Schopenhauer peering within himself and determining that the will was the most fundamental thing, and then extrapolating that to be the fundamental inner character of all reality, that's not an immediate certainty of Schopenhauer's, right? In the place of an immediate certainty, Nietzsche says we should have all these questions instead. And that, as he says at the end of the passage, the fact that you find that simply intuitively to be true, he's saying you can't trust your intuition, right? Your intuition tells you that the earth stands still. That can tell you, you can maybe trust your intuition insofar as, what would you say, for living, right? That's what it's for, but it's not, your intuition isn't there to give you knowledge about the quote unquote objective world, the world that's beyond your senses or beyond human intellect, right? We can't follow our intuition there. And so anyone who would put forward, for example, Descartes' cogito ergo sum, cogito ergo sum, that this is not even this, the idea that it's so basic. Well, I think, therefore I must exist as a thinking being. I mean, some of the things that Nietzsche raises here, you could just say are like just playing devil's advocate, but in a very real sense, I think he's being serious when he says, you don't know that it is I who thinks, and that the fact that there is something that thinking is happening means that there must be a thing that does the thinking. Because again, this is why we're freeing ourselves from the tyranny of words here. You're separating the doer and the deed, whereas Nietzsche would just simply say there's just a process playing out. You don't ever have to posit this existence of substance, because what Descartes' cogito ergo sum ends up producing is a soul atomism, right? The idea, well, I have my consciousness, and that's the indivisible atomon of my existence. This is the soul that I have. And if anything, in so many words, the broad thrust of this passage, I mean, he makes a rather brilliant argument that you would have to compare a state where you weren't thinking to a state in which you were thinking, which is fairly impossible. I would say it's fairly obvious that it's impossible to do. Like, you could say, well, I've had places in my life where I was out of my mind, events in my life, where I was blackout drunk or something like that. But that's the thing about being blackout drunk. You black out. You're not actually there for the events happening, right? When you get blackout drunk, what happens is you're not forming, I believe this is right, I might be wrong, but you're not able to form new memories, essentially. You've drank to the point where that ability is disrupted. So you're just that's why when you get really drunk and you're still somewhat conscious, if you ever talk to somebody who's in that state of inebriation, they'll sometimes repeat themselves or ask you the same thing over and over again, because they're actually unable to form new, their ability to form new memories is being inhibited in that moment. And so even if they don't completely black out that experience, they're not going to be able to remember in the moment exactly what is happening or what they just said or what they just did. But the funny thing about that is, so I've been that inebriated, and I have the vague memory. I mean, not really anything specific at this point, because that would have been years and years ago when I would, I don't really do that kind of thing now. But the fact that you have any memory of it at all, right? What we would really need to compare a state of unthinking to would be the actual memories that we don't have, if that makes sense. You'd have to compare it to a state of true unconsciousness. To really compare consciousness to something else, you would have to have the experience of not having any sort of conscious thought at all, which is sort of impossible. It's not impossible, because we'll all experience that when we die, right? Or when we go to sleep, at least before the state when we're dreaming and rapid eye movement sleep. Point being, you don't have any experience from the time when you're unconscious, right? When you lose consciousness to the point where you regain it again. So how are you going to compare your thinking to your unthinking state? Even the state of being blackout drunk is not truly a state of being unthinking or unconscious or what have you, right? Only unconsciousness is being unconscious. And so how can we truly define what thinking is if we don't know what it isn't? If our mentation is completely inseparable from the world as we experience it, right? We don't live in a cold, dead, unthinking, unwilling, dead world, right? Or unconscious world, rather. We live in the conscious experience of existence, in which, thoughts, you could say, permeate throughout our experience of reality constantly. And being able to distinguish that from feeling or thinking is not actually an obvious or easy thing to do. So Nietzsche even questions this immediate certainty of I think, right? The famous cogito ergo sum of Descartes is thrown into question here. And you would be surprised how many people out there will still take this as a sort of immediate certainty. But at the end of this section, Nietzsche, I think, brings us back, he grounds us again in comprehending this critique of Descartes in light of his broader philosophical project, because he says, like, let the people, for their part, think that philosophy consists of knowing things entirely. So knowing the absolute universal truth. The idea of the truth of the average person is that of the dogmatist. And of course it would be. So he says at the end, the person who says, I think and know that this at least is true, actual, and certain. So I know at least one thing is true, actual, and certain, and that's that I think, right? This very deep desire to cling to find some sort of universal or dogmatic certainty that we can hold on to. Just like the way that we search for some sort of atomon in the physical world, something indivisible that we can latch onto and therefore say that there is substance, something that does partake of being about the world, that is not just simply this slippery becoming that we can't really grab hold of with our world of abstract thoughts, this world that does partake of being, right? That's where being exists, is in the consciousness, in the conscious thought. And so at least this, that I think, that is true and certain, right? Even Nietzsche, when he was sort of bringing us back to the basic truth of our sense organs, ends that section with a question mark, right? That even that is sort of like he's trying to bring us over to his way of thinking and to raise the questions ourselves, not necessarily to install that as a dogmatic truth. So he even ends that with a question mark. It's not even really a certainty that our sensation is quote unquote true, because what do we mean by that exactly? But so he says, if you encounter a person who says, I think and know that this at least is true, actual, and certain, the new philosopher, the true philosopher, give him a smile and 2 question marks. Sir, it is improbable that you are not mistaken. So read, it is probable that you are mistaken, but why insist on the truth? And notice that's only one question. So what's the second question, right? So the first question is, why insist on the truth? And that sheds light on what Nietzsche is doing with bringing things back to sensation, or when he posits will to power as being the essence of life, as he did in an earlier section that we looked at today, that Nietzsche is not insisting on the truth in the sense of the old dogmatists, which has, you could look at it as dangerous implications to it, but in some sense, that's Nietzsche's method of searing through these endless metaphysical circles, this whirlpool that will drag you down to solipsism, right? To find to hit bottom and find that all you have is a certain nothing to lay down on and die, right? That Nietzsche is willing to take that whole carload of beautiful possibilities. He's willing to live in the uncertainty and say, I'm going to discover truths that are mine, that will help me to live, right? And so, why insist on the truth is sort of asking, why, in some sense, why do you need the fact that you think? Why do you need to use that? Why are you clinging to that as the thing that can be your absolute certainty so that you can have something certain, something that is being, something that's enduring and indivisible? And why are you insisting on that as a truth that then must be accepted by others, right? Must be accepted as a universal dogmatic truth from, in some sense. So as to what the second question is, I think I may have come up with what I think the second question is at other times, but there are a number of possibilities to what the second question could be. That Nietzsche, in some sense, is the fact that he's letting us fill in the blank itself says something here, right? But that second question could involve, like, why insist on the truth when your perspective, why insist on reifying your conception of the cogito ergo sum into a dogmatic truth, dogmatic meaning turning, the truth on its head and denying perspective, when from your perspective, right? From the immediate certainty of your intuition and your experience, that's the closest thing to a truth that you have. So in some sense, you can't deny it from your perspective. it doesn't need to be universalized. It doesn't need to be proselytized if you're truly certain of it, right? But then that raises the question, are you actually truly certain of it? Or is there something in the back of your mind that says, I don't know if cogito ergo sum actually does demonstrate this, it does actually provide me with that bedrock of certainty that we arrive at through the methodological doubt. So perhaps the second question involves that. Like, when are we going to stop following this road of the methodological doubt, imagining that what we're doing is this disinterested truth-seeking, and realize that that pathway only leads down to the certain nothing, right? Again, I guess I'm sort of still asking a variation on the why insist on the truth question. But again, fill in the blank for yourself what that second question is, of where you could then proceed with your own inquiry following along from these considerations. So, with that being said, I think we're at a good stopping point for today. We're going to definitely finish up on the Prejudices of Philosophers in the next episode. We might even have time to get into some of the next sections on the free spirit, which is the next division of the text, the second division. I think we'll probably get to at least the beginning of that. It'd be nice to kind of conclude with some of those beginning sections of the free spirit next episode. So hopefully we'll get there. This episode is about the pace that I'm going to aim for in future episodes, and we'll probably continue to hit sections that I've already gone over in past episodes. And that's what's kind of cool or interesting about doing this episode at the place in the podcast that we're doing it, or at this point in the podcast, because I can then, there's a lot of sections like that one on Kant and the synthetic judgments a priori. If I had just given the explanation that I gave today, I'd probably be very dissatisfied with my ability to explain that passage. But because there's like a whole episode that concerns it, or at least a significant chunk of an episode that concerns that idea, you can go do another deep dive into that if you want. So it's like I have my references here of all my past work. And if you want to hear a talk about these specific issues, you can go and look at those. So, we've talked a lot about the congenital defect of philosophers episode, and now the Descartes episode. The Schopenhauer episodes probably be very important as well. Even though we're not always talking about Schopenhauer, I feel like so many of the concepts in Nietzsche are a lot easier. Like that, if you have an understanding of what Schopenhauer was doing, so many things kind of open their doors to you with Nietzsche. So that's all for today. Thank you, everybody. I will see you next week. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.